Welcome to this event hosted by the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz. I'm very glad to have a book discussion today. This is an event which is organized in the framework of the context of extremism in the MENA region and the Balkan societies, which is a Horizon 2020 project to which the University of Graz is one of the participants. In this framework of this project, we are researching what is called context of violent extremism, including the Balkans and the Middle East region, but it is also very much looking at the drivers of it, but in attempts to look at it critically and not in a certain way accepting conventional wisdom and in a certain way reflecting on also the debates of the last decade on this issue. So in our event today, I'm very glad that we are having a book discussion and we're having a great panel today, and the book, which exists in physical form for all those who have forgotten that books do exist, they are, of course, exist also electronically. Darryl Lee, who has written a wonderful book called The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity, which was published just recently with Stanford University Press. Darryl is an anthropologist and a lawyer who is affiliated with the Department of Anthropology of the University of Chicago. And this book is based on extensive research. We'll hear a lot more about it. And I'll just introduce the other panelists. We'll have also on the panel Anna Meier, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and also affiliated there with the Institute of Legal Studies, and she's looking at kind of critical understanding of what terrorism is meant by this kind of concepts and the labels by states. We have Asya Metodieva, who is a researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. She recently obtained her PhD from Central European University, and she's looked at radical movements, polarization, and information warfare there, and has looked at foreign fighters in the context of the Balkans. And then we have Ejub Kostić, who is a PhD candidate for political science at the University of Belgrade, who has extensively researched young Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina and has done a lot of work on Islam in the Balkans and been also a guest already at our center. So for those of you who have not been in any of our book panels or discussions, we're going to proceed as follows. We're going to first hear from Darryl, who's going to tell us a little bit about the book, the research, some of the questions he's raising, and then all of the panelists will have a chance to reflect on their take on the book, to which Darryl will then go back to in the end and respond to, and then we'll open the floor for your questions and comments. So you're welcome to raise your hand, and then I'll call upon you to turn on the camera and microphone to ask any questions, both to Darryl as well as to the other panelists, because we want to have this as a conversation about the book, but also about the topics the book opens. So that doesn't require that you have read the book, although hopefully you will soon and be convinced by it through this conversation. And of course, you can also write comments and questions in the chat. I will pick up some of those questions in putting them forward to our panelists. Just keep in mind, we're recording this, so if you are asking any questions, you will be recorded and we will put up the conversation on our YouTube channel afterwards, just so that you know that. So let's just get started. So I would hand over the floor to Darryl to tell us a little bit more about this book and what made him write it. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us on Zoom. Thank you so much, Florian, for inviting me to discuss the book. I'm really eager to do so. Thank you also, Lura, for all of the heroic work you've done to make this event possible. And last but not least, thank you so much, Anna, Asya, and Ivan, for agreeing to engage with the text. I'm really looking forward to discussing it further with you, as well as with everyone else here in this event. So this book, The Universal Enemy, grows out of about 15 years of research on the topic of so-called jihadist foreign fighters who participated in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1992 and 1995. And it's based largely on fieldwork conducted in Bosnia, about 13 months or so, as well as additional research in probably about a half dozen other countries in the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia and in Europe. And At its most simple level, the book tries to tell the story of a group of people who have been widely discussed in the region and further afield, but not necessarily well understood. And by that, of course, I'm referring to the so-called Mujahideen who came during the war, mostly from the Middle East. And, you know, I think I'm going to assume, based on the fact that this is the Center for Southeast European Studies, that folks have a kind of baseline familiarity with the dominant narrative, right? The dominant narrative essentially being that these individuals came, they perpetrated atrocities and war crimes in the context of the conflict, and also that they brought particular interpretations of Islam that are often kind of understood as radical or retrograde, and were seen as essentially alien in the context of religious practice among Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think there's two kind of major versions of this narrative, right? The first is what I just said, but then using that essentially as a stick in kind of nationalist political contestation, a stick with which to essentially beat up on Bosniaks, right? So the narrative here is that, you know, these people are not only fundamentalists, but they expose the fundamentalist and non-Western orientation of Bosniak, sort of the Bosniak political project, or of Muslims in Bosnia, more broadly speaking. So that's one kind of dominant narrative that, you know, I don't subscribe to and I'm sort of writing against. The other narrative is a narrative of what can be thought of as embarrassment among sort of Bosniak publics, right? So this narrative basically acknowledges or doesn't contest the portrayal of these people as essentially barbaric and retrograde and whatever, but wants to essentially displace responsibility for them onto other actors, right? So in this narrative, the idea is these people imposed themselves on Bosniaks. They were uninvited guests. Perhaps they were even sent by outside players with the agenda to make Bosniaks look bad, right? And while that narrative, I think, is at least it has the benefit of rejecting the conflation of, you know, Muslims in Bosnia and other Muslims and so on, it doesn't necessarily really take on the demonization of these individuals. And I should stress that, you know, among Bosniak publics, the reactions are varied and mixed, right? So there are individuals who appreciate the sort of sacrifices and efforts of these fighters, and others who resent them deeply, and sometimes people do both. So what I wanted to do in the book is really just to inject some research into the conversation. So it's really based on both long-term ethnographic life history interviews with participants in the Jihad, both Bosnian and Arab, as well as archival research, including internal documents of the unit of foreign fighters, and publications in various languages. And the book really shows how so most of these foreign fighters were concentrated into a special unit, Katibat al-Mujahideen in Arabic, or Order al-Mujahideen in Bosnian. And this unit was part of the Bosnian army, and fought under the flag of Bosnia-Herzegovina and took orders from Bosnian generals. But at the same time, it was led by Arabs who appointed their own leadership, raised their own funds from abroad, and also acted in the idiom of pan-Islamic solidarity, right? So on the one hand, they're fighting in the name of a global Muslim community, or ummah, and they embrace sort of theological tendencies within Islam that are often labeled as, you know, Salafi or Wahhabi. Yet at the same time, they are fighting under the command of generals who are ostensibly committed to a multinational secular nation state project. So the book really tries to understand how they balanced these different agendas, and also gets into the backstory of the individuals who came to fight, most of whom the book discovers were already migrants in one form or another. Right. So a lot of the individuals who fought in Bosnia, it was their first jihad. They didn't come from like Afghanistan or whatever, which is often the narrative. A lot of them were migrant workers in Italy. By taking the perspective of migrants and moving away from a nation state-based perspective, I really try to show how folks are moving between different categories of mobility, right? So a lot of the individuals I interviewed were migrant workers in one moment, pilgrims in another, humanitarian aid workers, and fighters at different points in their lives. And that oftentimes these different activities were seen as paths to a common goal of helping fellow Muslims in Bosnia, albeit through different methods. So the first half of the book in particular really tries to sort of lay out this story and just give it a more solid empirical basis than what you normally sort of get. Scaling up slightly, I think, for folks who work on the region who are engaged in Southeast Europe or ex-Yugoslav area studies, one of the larger arguments is that we need to take more seriously the category of race and to think more expansively about connections with non-Western parts of the world. I think a lot of the discourse, both scholarly and policy and otherwise, has been very Europe and westward focused, especially since the fall of socialism. So, if we think, for example, of the iconic and well-cited arguments around like Balkanism, right, as a form of Orientalism, there's often this sense that, it's the Balkans versus the West, right? And, one can be more critical of, the European project or less critical of it, but it's very much focused in that direction. And while those arguments are very important, what they tend to lose sight of is, it's not simply that the West treats the Balkans like Africa or Asia, but that there's actual histories and present connections between the Balkans and Africa and Asia. And thinking about people who are treated on the one hand as peripheral and quasi-colonized, for lack of a better term, by the West, but who at the same time in global hierarchies of race are also considered white in other contexts, right? So the book really tries to think seriously about both of those dilemmas at the same time. And I think that's something that is being kind of taken up in the broader interest in especially histories of ex-Yugoslavia that have kind of taken up the non-aligned movement. I see the book as really kind of aligned with a lot of those newer interests and research agendas. And then just scaling up one more level, kind of at the most conceptual level for anthropology, the book really tries to explore the concept of universalism as a lived practice. So normally we talk about universalism as sort of lofty set of ideals like human rights or humanitarianism, and then usually that's followed by some sort of refutation, right? Like, oh, the Western powers are hypocritical, so on and so forth. I don't have any problem with those critiques per se, but I think what they miss out on is that there are often people in the world who are engaged in their own universalist projects, but that may not be recognized as such, right? So in places of armed conflict and intervention, whether we're talking about Bosnia or Iraq or so on, there's this tendency to talk about certain outsiders as internationals, right? And of course, for folks who work on Bosnia-Herzegovina, this is very familiar. But then there are other folks who are also outsiders who are glossed as foreign, right? So the book really tries to get at what's at stake, right? Why are UN peacekeepers international forces rather than foreign fighters, right? Why are the Arab Mujahideen glossed as foreign Arabs rather than as fellow Muslims? And what's at stake in those moves, right? So even the category of foreign fighter, it really bursts into prominence during the US invasion of Iraq, right? And it was a term that was popularized by the US military to differentiate between Iraqi insurgents, who they thought of as people who could be won over, versus insurgents coming from outside who were seen as, diehard, fanatical people who essentially could not be negotiated with. But the fact that they were being described as foreign fighters by an invading army that was like several 100,000 strong, that kind of got dropped out of the conversation, right? I mean, the US Army was, of course, the largest group of foreign fighters around in Iraq at the time. So what I'm trying to do with the book is not just to sort of call out the hypocrisy of that, but to actually ask, what makes it possible for people to make those kinds of claims about who's universal and who's foreign, and to have that and have those claims just sort of seem like taken for granted and normal. And in that sense, the book compares this sort of jihad mobilization with other universalist projects as they played out in Bosnia. So there's a chapter on the socialist non-aligned movement, there's a chapter on UN peacekeeping, and there's a chapter on the war on terror. And at first it might seem strange to have a book that puts all of these things together, but what I hope to show for those who make the time to read it is that the methods and the concepts that get developed as a way to make the jihad understandable as more than just a security threat or a bunch of crazy people, that those analytical tools can also help us better understand the social reality of UN peacekeepers, of the non-aligned movement, and of the war on terror by focusing on like the actual lived experiences and histories of the people involved in this kind of travel, right, between the Balkans and other parts of the world, especially kind of, Africa and Asia. So anyway, that's my best attempt at a brief synopsis of the book. I'm really eager to hear what the interlocutors have to say and to engage with anyone else who may have questions.
Great, thanks a lot, Darryl. And indeed, there's a lot of rich material in there, which of course makes this story a lot more vivid in terms of the conversations you're leading and also the perspective. And I think maybe that's something we can talk about, is the perspective, also how you came in there, because of course access is a difficult question, and the way you're engaging also with those is, I think, really exciting and quite challenging in many ways. But I don't want to take any more time, and I'll hand over to Anna for her comments, observations, and questions you might raise. I'm just making sure that she is able to, I think it should work now.
Yes, awesome, thank you. Technical difficulties still, we can't escape them, sadly, even after a year of this. Thank you, Darryl, for that excellent introduction to the book. And I'll start with two apologies. First, that I'll have to leave a little bit early. And second, that I will be forcing an interaction today between Dr. Lee's work and terrorism studies, a community to which he is quite explicit that he is not trying to contribute. But I think that there is much for scholars of something called terrorism to learn from this work. And I speak today as a researcher of the terrorism label as a weapon of the politically powerful, and one that policymakers have shaped into an entire project that separates violence helpful to the US-European imperial project from that which challenges it. And in this effort, academics who study terrorism, or who decided in the aftermath of 9/11 that this was an opportune moment to do so, become, sort of quoting from the book, less faithful scribes of empire than they are enterprising vendors eagerly hawking new wares in the hopes of catching the eye of a fickle and easily distracted patron. And we see this pattern repeating itself now in the aftermath of the Trump era and the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., as terrorism experts have sought to refashion themselves as right-wing terrorism experts, as that subject becomes sort of the lucrative flavor of the week. And so I think now is also an opportune moment to consider what the universal enemy has to teach the terrorism research community. So I'm going to make 3 points. First, that the book gives us a template for studying terms and concepts like terrorism, extremism, jihad, as they are used by political actors, rather than trying to reclaim them as quote unquote objective categories. Second, by examining a local conflict with a global draw in a region racialized as white, as Dr. Lee has already mentioned, the work has something to teach us about responses to conflict in other similar regions, with important implications, I think, for our understanding of white supremacist violence today. And finally, the book's arguments about solidarity as opposed to sovereignty as a foundation for authority within a community turns our eye towards a bottom-up orientation for future research under the broad umbrella of terrorism studies. So first, the universal enemy shows us what we can learn by studying how loaded or contentious concepts are used, rather than what loaded or contentious concepts are. So Dr. Lee is very upfront in his approach to studying jihad. It's futile, he says, to try to arrive at a correct interpretation of jihad. And indeed, as he traces international responses to various actions that have been called jihad, from the insurgencies of the Cold War to intervention in the Balkans under this label of humanitarianism, to the contemporary global war on terror, he highlights just how varied and at times capricious the concept of jihad can be. He doesn't take readers through religious texts in an attempt to unearth a quote unquote true meaning, nor does he attempt to assuage liberal consciences by refusing to consider the times that Jihad has meant violence to the folks pursuing it. By simply analyzing how the term jihad is used, he both highlights the complexity that the concept holds for insiders and how outsider unwillingness to hold that complexity has flattened the term into caricatures. And I think those of us who study something called terrorism could stand to do the same. In my own work, I'm frequently asked, usually with a frustrated sigh, to please just define terrorism, rather than relaying how others have used the term. The concern seems to be that I can't possibly have coherent scope conditions if I don't impose a definition. But I think if we take Dr. Lee's approach seriously, we can see how choosing a particular context, like the Bosnian Jihad, and seeking to understand how a concept like jihad is understood by various actors within that context can in fact shed new light on individual motivations for political behavior and reactions to that behavior. And applying this approach to terrorism studies would require us to view the terrorist category as embedded in larger political projects, such that the contexts we might view as singular armed conflicts are in fact more global in scope. So a broad scope is not a methodological flaw, but an empirical reality. Second thing, the book has really important lessons for the recent surge in interest in white supremacist violence, even though it's not about white supremacist violence. Dr. Lee reminds us that unlike other jihads in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, the Balkans have long been racialized as white in some contexts. This racialization was crucial for the region to be deemed worthy of quote unquote saving and possible to be saved from a communist other, which also has deep roots in the US context where I'm from in anti-Black and brown racism, which has then had implications around the globe. It's therefore not a surprise that this region, existing at the nexus of old universalist ideological rifts, becomes the site for an international intervention that the US, UN, and NATO all characterize as a humanitarian mission. And it's not a surprise that the veterans of this conflict are cast as non-white war criminals when it becomes clear that the political project for which they're fighting doesn't align with the white American vision for what universalism should underpin global security. And so it's worth considering, I think, how the US responded to the mujahideen, foreign fighters, volunteers, travelers, what have you, in the Balkans through the lens of the global war on terror, and what kinds of resistance, violent or otherwise, become permissible in a context where violence is racialized as other. So fighting in a region racialized as white against prevailing white powers sort of became a trial run, I think, for US narratives of protecting the world from a brown boogeyman, which were then solidified and reproduced via the imprisonment and application of the terrorism label to these fighters, which Dr. Lee details so well towards the end of the book. The supposedly benevolent universalism of US European dominance, because all we are trying to do is protect people from terrorism, of course, is then challenged when white individuals embrace the white supremacy that we all know underlies that benevolence, but that perpetuates itself by remaining unspoken. So if we start to think about not only transnational jihad, but also transnational white supremacist violence, I think Dr. Lee's work has important warnings about keeping the concept of universalisms front and center. Transnational white supremacist violence will not fundamentally alter the universalist projects of the United States and its allies, but it will give an opportunity to refashion underlying white supremacy into something extreme and violent, rather than something structural and sometimes subtle. Here also, we could use far more nuance than the terrorism research community in particular has afforded this type of violence. Last, I want to talk about solidarity and its juxtaposition with sovereignty, which I think has implications not only for how we understand participants in the Bosnian and other conflicts, but also how we might approach the enterprise of research in terrorism studies and adjacent fields. So in the book, Dr. Lee reminds us that sovereignty, a principle that we often take for granted in the modern state system, is in fact only one type of authority, and we can choose to center other types. Solidarity, he argues, was at the core of the Bosnian Jihad, and we miss its role because we view authority and structure as stemming from the state. But in Bosnia, members of the Jihad organized themselves around shared goals, often unrelated to any state project, which is not to say those goals were not of concern to state actors. Rather, any relationship to the state was irrelevant or orthogonal. So solidarity rests on foundations other than one's relationship to the state. It can rest in the Muslim Ummah, a transnational religious community. It can rest today in shared racial identities among whites within the concept of global white supremacy. But importantly, thinking about solidarity leads us to consider how communities form from the bottom up, rather than being imposed from the top down, and might create systems of rules and belonging built on collective concerns that are, again, orthogonal to the state system. And thinking about solidarity also calls us to consider our own positionality vis-a-vis the communities that we study. That might seem an obvious point to some of us, depending on the disciplines and traditions in which we are trained. But concerns about positionality are largely missing from terrorism studies. And I think this is because we lock ourselves into a state-centric framework, where states, and particularly the US state, are on the right side of history. And we assume that we as researchers are generally aligned with state projects and state goals, such that any animosity that we might hold towards those who challenge or exist outside of the state system is natural and morally justifiable. Conversely, if we thought more about solidarity as a system of authority, as Dr. Lee challenges us to do, we'd have to ask ourselves where identification with a cause like Jihad comes from, and whether we ourselves might hold such identifications or feel strongly opposed to those identifications due to other components of our identities. So taking solidarity seriously would, I think, force us to ask questions about our complicity, if not outright participation, in state projects within the space of terrorism and counterterrorism, and hopefully push us to consider ways to study these phenomena from a different angle. So thank you all again for being here today. Thank you to Dr. Lee for writing this. I've enjoyed it immensely, if that were not obvious.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate very much also bringing in a certain way what kind of conversations that it opens up. And I think the question of both solidarity and universalism are important themes to kind of further discuss. But now let me turn to Asya to have her share her thoughts about the book before we then turn to Ivan. So Asya, go ahead.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you once again for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, and I recall the moment when I opened the book of Darryl Lee for the first time at the Library of Central European University. It was just published, and it was very surprising account. I remember reading it and seeing the story from a completely different angle, a story that I've been also researching for my PhD. What I really liked about the book back then was, and still appreciate very much, is that it gives terrorism scholars a completely different point of view. It doesn't take security perspective. It shows the human face of the story, avoiding both victimization and glorification of the people who are interviewed and who were part of the war theater. So the first thing that I would like to engage with is the problem of the narratives. One thing that Dr. Lee mentioned in the beginning. The question is, why do we have these narratives? The two major narratives he mentioned, the one that basically fuels nationalism and contestations in the region, and the other one of embarrassment of locals who are trying to remove responsibility and to say, look, these people were sent by external forces, they are outsiders. So one possible reading that the book gives is that actually we have an interplay of causes, we have interplay of narratives, and also we have interplay of speakers. It depends very much who defines this story, who tells the story. And in this sense, I think that the definition of some actors on the ground being seen as foreign and other people, other actors seen as peacekeepers, comes exactly from this storytelling, which is very much like Western dominated and dominated by the international community back then and for all the years. So what I really believe is that the definition of foreign is related to the way we define the cause and who defines the cause. One story is the one that we hear through the narrative of people who speak in the book, through the interviews, and on the other hand, we have the dominant one, which comes with the narrative of international organizations and Western countries. So this is also very much related to like one thing that I try to engage with this conversation, whether terrorists and whether people we label as terrorists or foreign fighters nowadays are insiders or outsiders. And I think that the Bosnian War and the way how Darryl engages with this conversation helps a lot to understand that basically these lines are very blurred, and it's again about who tells us who is the outsider and the insider in relation to the conflict. And this is an issue that remains unsolved in the literature on Bosnia and terrorism generally. And nowadays, with like thinking of European jihadists, like the latest wave, whether they're insiders or outsiders, I think that the book speaks very much to or gives very, very interesting answers to this question. And it is applicable to what we are dealing with right now. The other thing that I really found interesting, and it's very new and very necessary, that the story of jihad is not limited to a particular context. But this is like the way he does it is not the way we speak about jihad nowadays, in a way that all terrorists or all foreign fighters or the path to Islamist militancy is the same, is universal. The way he does it is through showing that the event, or let's say the war, is not the particular setting in which we should look for understanding or particular explanation to this. And the concept of universalism actually helps a lot, not simply seen as an ideology, but as a practice, as Darryl says. And it's not only a question of empirical reality, and I really liked this clarification in the very beginning of the book. It's not a question of normative validity or doesn't seek for any explanatory power, but it's rather aspiration. And this is actually the bridging understanding, or the bridging definition to the other forms of universalism he engages with. What I really found particularly enriching is, and I was like very much challenged, because like I started reading his book in the beginning of my write-up of my PhD. So I was dealing with how to define networks, how to define groups, how to define all these people who are somehow connected. And we can see that they interact within the framework of the war and after that. But then we need to find certain way to define networks. And what terrorism literature does is like it takes like purely security perspective. It takes the idea that we have groups of people who are led by some sort of like a terrorist cause. I would just like stop for a second, because I'm not sure if you can hear me well. Can you hear me? Is the connection okay? Okay, excellent. So the surprising explanation or the very different approach to networks is something that I found particularly enriching when I was reading this book. So Lee takes broader perspective of what networks means and should mean in this literature, that we usually the way we think when we research and write about terrorism is again purely security perspective, whereas he broadens this horizon by looking at this global hierarchies of phrase. And this is like something that is very unique to what we have seen and read in literature on this topic. And the way he does this is by actually engaging with these structural dilemmas that universalism share. And I might have a question for Dr. Lee for later after we finish the interventions and he has the chance to answer the questions. But the question I had in mind is whether there are differences in the emergence and the spread of these universalist projects he's looking at. Because some of them are more, or we can claim that they're more top-down, whereas other are more bottom-up. And what does this tell us about the application of universalism to global jihad? Can we say that the structures that appear are more emerging from natural, or let's say bottom-up movements, or it's more about sort of interplay of ideas from top down and bottom up, is this complex mixture. So in this sense, I think that comparing the global jihad, or the calls in relation to the Bosnian war, to other forms of universalism is particularly important and enriching. And finally, the question I had in mind, just to make a quick bridge to what I'm working on, is whether this form of universalism he finds, especially in the context of this American empire, the era of America, how this argument may be applicable to other conflicts in the region, for instance, to the conflict in Kosovo. Because I would say that there might be a very, very different or nuanced understanding of how actually the Mujahideen engaged with this conflict compared to the Bosnian war. Whether there is a different understanding of a network from this perspective, or we still can claim that what happened in Kosovo and the way the Arab Mujahideen engaged with the conflict is basically supportive of this claim of universalism. Again, like I know that this is not an empirical claim, but I, as a person who is more empirical in my research, I would be very curious to hear more about this in the session today. I'm going to stop here, and very much looking forward for the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Asya, for raising those questions as well, which I'm sure Darryl will be happy to answer in the final round afterwards. But let's first hear from Ivan about his take and his reading of the book and his thoughts. So Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian, for inviting me, first of all. First of all, I would like to say that I read the book literally immediately when it was published, and I think it was 2020, if I'm correct. And the main reason why I was keen to read the book immediately was, when it was published, was that I has heard about Professor Lee's project and the topic of the book from our common friends and colleagues in Sarajevo. While I was doing my field research for my PhD thesis, in which, among other things, I had dealt with the relationship between pan-Islamism and ethno-nationalism in the context of Bosniak Muslims. One of the topics that also the Professor Lee is tackling is in his book. Among the people who told me about the Professor Lee's book was also a daughter of one of the main protagonists of the book, and that is namely Imad al-Hussein, or Abu Hamza. Though through Abu Hamza's daughter, I became directly or indirectly familiar with huge injustice that Imad al-Hussein, Abu Hamza, family suffered. And of course, not only the family, but in the first place himself. But before I go to some of the, maybe I will be more critical than previous speakers of some of the topics from your book. I'm not someone who is coming from the field of security studies. Also, I'm not a lawyer or human rights expert. As Florian in the beginning just mentioned, I'm predominantly dealing with political theory, with a special focus on Islamic movements, more generally and more concretely, with social movement theory in the context of different types of Islamic activism, okay? But what is equally important, or in the case of this panel, what you said, Professor Lee, because this is Center for Southern Eastern European Studies, is that my research is decisively focused on Islam in the Balkans, okay? So, and because of this, I will try to concentrate and reflect upon the contents of the book that deals with Bosnia during the 90s and the Islamic scene at that time, and of course, in which way it can be relevant for us today, or how can we read all of this. or understand. So in the very beginning, I would like to emphasize the thing that I really think that you have done brilliantly, and that it is very well written, these individual trajectories through which we can get to know not only the destinies of the former members of Al-Katiba unit, or let's say Mujahideens, but also to see to which degree Bosnia and Herzegovina was, and still is, a colonized state that functions into a significant extent at the behest of Western states and societies, that is unconditionally obeying the wishes and desires of the US administration and the EU member states. And I think that this is we can see clearly this in the chapter of the book when you are discussing how they stripped out the citizenship of the former members, how they deployed them or expelled them, detained them, and so on and so on. But now I will maybe become a little bit critical about some topics from your subjects, from your book, is beside this really excellently written personal stories of former members of Al-Katiba unit, in my modest opinion, the book has some important, let's say, I would say shortcomings, especially in the context, or let's say on the domain of giving the proper historical context. Because I think that historical context is especially important when in ethnographical approach, which you are using, Professor Lee, in your book. And if one overlooks some of the more significant aspects of the historical context, that researcher can easily come to some possibly wrong conclusions. Yeah. So, and I will just give, for example, one example that I dealt in my PhD thesis, as I said, this pan-Islamism and ethno-nationalism, because I think that you, for example, you are claiming in your book that the pan-Islamism and nationalism are mutually reinforcing each other. Yeah. And if we take this claim or this idea, this in Bosnian case is a highly problematic one. This is, of course, from my personal research and my personal opinion, because Bosnia and Herzegovina, from my perspective, is the brilliant example for quite the opposite, that the pan-Islamism and nationalism is an absolute clash. They cannot be mutually going. Maybe I'm saying, because I'm dealing with another Islamic movements around the world, I think that we can say that there are examples of that they can, let's say, reinforce each other in the sense that they compete with each other. But in Bosnia, they're in complete clash. And when I'm saying this, I think that that the best example is how the pan-Islamic worldview was subordinated and brutally rejected in favor of ethno-national politics by Party of Democratic Action, which was established, by the way, by Alija Izetbegović, the first president, and who was the president during the 90s. But what is even more important, that he was, before the Party of Democratic Action, the most vocal proponent of pan-Islamism and pan-Islamic worldview, which he absolutely abandoned and rejected, and accepted the ethno-national politics, because the pan-Islamism was or let's say Islamism/pan-Islamism was in that moment in the 90s, he realized, and the group around him, that it is completely utopian idea in the Bosnia in the 90s, and not only utopian, but is not useful for the thing, and especially in the moment of aggression of Serbia and Croatia on Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is the thing. This is more a question, not a criticism, of course. But my question: why you completely, let's say, overlooked, or you didn't dealt with the Ali Izetbegović and his past, and the group around the Ali Izetbegović and Party of Democratic Action? And why I'm emphasizing this also, because it is very important to see how the Party of Democratic Action betrayed these people, the members of Al-Katiba unit, after the war, and how they completely, of course, change their ideas and their narratives and their worldviews. Okay, so this is the first thing. The second thing that I think that also maybe that I'm interested, I think that we can. I'm not the only one. I know that Professor Devji was also writing about the influence of Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I could also add to this what he wrote in his some comments, is that also it is very interesting that I know that you are mentioning the some of the Hezbollah. But and also the role of Iran, but the role of Iran is not, I would argue that it is not enough. You know, we cannot see enough clear, you know, influence from the state level of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kuwait, Turkey as well, and also some Islamic movement or Islamists movement around the world who supported enormously the Bosniak Muslims during the 90s. For example, the great example is the Refah Party and the Necmettin Erbakan in Turkey, and their support, and so on and so on. And what is also interesting, I will come back, I just mentioned that Omer Behman and Hassan Cengic, and this, you are mentioning Al Hasnain and this route, but also what is important that Omer Behman, for example, was the ambassador in Iran during the 90s. And so Iran was a very interesting player. And again, we have this betrayal of Iran after the end of the war of the 90s. We can say Iran is completely sidelined in the Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is very interesting for me. And also this relationship toward because we are talking about some kind of universality. If you're talking about the universality of Muslims, then we have this Shia, Saudi, this whole division and different actors and so on. And lastly, the third thing that I really think that it is extremely important is the question of the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I think that this is a crucial one, because through the Islamic community, because I'm dealing with the, as I said, beside Islamic in the Balkans, I'm dealing with the anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Muslim Islamophobia, and CV projects, which becoming more and more CV industry. And the role of the Islamic community today is very important in the CV industry in Bosnia and Herzegovina, extremely important. And when I'm saying this, I'm referring to, because and all of this wouldn't be possible if during the 90s the Islamic community wasn't heavily nationalized, went through the process of heavy nationalization and also the ethnicization of the community. It became some kind of a exclusive Bosniak community, which is, you know, doing everything it can to ostracize, and not only to ostracize, but to securitize everyone who thinks differently than the mainstream Islamic community. And now we have even this paradox that you have in the Islamic community, the constitution of the official constitution of the Islamic community, some kind of official dogma that if you are not following this Islamic this dogma of the Islamic community, you are risking to be declared as a member of. I'm sure that you know this because you were also doing the field work in the Bosnia, as a member of para-Jemaats, these para-Jemaats, and people who were in the 90s ostracized, or let's say members of the Al-Katiba, or seen by many Bosnian Muslims as some kind of the others. Are these the pro-Salafi and pro-Wahhabi or blah blah? Are today again not only the members of the Al-Katiba, but the followers of any other understanding of Islam, madhab, kalam, or any other, Islamic beliefs that are not recognized by the Islamic communities. They are, doomed to be or defined as some kind of ultimate other. Yeah. So this is some kind of my comments, but in the end, I would really like to express two things also, and this is that I really think that your main topic, and this is a global war on terror and this American empire and everything, I absolutely cherish your work, and I think that it is of utmost importance. And from my personal perspective, I really think that your, what I already mentioned, that this individual trajectories, but generally what your reflection upon the members of Al-Katiba unit is extremely valuable one and extremely important one in the context what you, in your introduction, Professor Lee, what you have said, and that is the bashing, what is used to bash the Bosniaks today by Serbs and Croats because of these bad guys and these, as mujahideen and this and that. So I think that this is extremely important, how you portray this, how you explain the Al-Katiba unit, and so on. Of course, I have some other questions and reflections, but I will leave this for the let's say Q&A, or let's say discussion afterwards. Thank you a lot.
Great, thanks Ivan, and thanks to all of the panelists for their questions. So I'd now give Darryl a chance to respond, address some of the comments, and then open up the floor to questions from the audience. And of course, all of you are already able to start raising your hands or put the questions in the chat, as Darryl is picking up some of the questions and comments which we've heard over the last 45 minutes or so. So Darryl, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. These are amazing comments. I'll go in reverse order. So Ivan, I appreciate your criticisms very much, and I want the book to be engaged with and criticized precisely by people like you who are doing really interesting, important, and cutting-edge research on Islam and Muslims in Bosnia. So I really appreciate your comments. I completely agree with your critique of the Islamska zajednica, the Islamic community. And I think, for outsiders, they're often taken in by this discourse of, we're the bridge between civilizations, Bosnia and Islam is this tolerant project. And you're absolutely right to point out the nefarious sort of aspects of this. In terms of your criticisms, I think what I would say is, and they're all very well placed, I think that part of what I am trying to do with this book, but I should have been more explicit about it, is to kind of open up the category of what do we even mean by pan-Islamism? Because I think if pan-Islamism is understood in terms of governments and in terms of sort of political movements that are state-oriented, then I think the Faisal Deji critique that you alluded to is correct. The book fails in that account, right? It doesn't talk extensively about Turkey's role, Iran's role, whatever. But the reason why that is the case is I'm actually trying to write against the tendency to talk about pan-Islamism only in those terms. And also because the folks who I'm writing about, that I didn't find it to be particularly helpful to think of them as extensions of, the Refat Party in Turkey, for example, or, because there's so many different layers and types of pan-Islamic activity going on at the same time. And, I think what a lot of the secondary literature had done was basically to just take everything that was being done in the name of Muslim solidarity with Bosnia, and to try to find a way of fitting it into the jihad mobilizations. And part of what I was trying to do is really to push against that and to say, we can't really, we have to start with the jihad fighters on their own terms, and then explore, the links that they may or may not have with the well-known groups, whether we're talking about, the Muslim Brothers or the Rafat Party, or some of these like majority Muslim states. So if it had been a book that was trying to tell the story of pan-Islamism in Bosnia more generally, then yeah, it would have been a very different account. And I think that's a book that is yet to be written, and I would be very interested to read it. Right, a book that that really centered the perspectives of these other actors, because in terms of the overall weight of pan-Islamic activity, of course, they're more important than the fighters. Right, so I will be very clear: the fighters I am writing about have attracted disproportionate attention, right? If they stand in for pan-Islamic solidarity with Bosnia, that is problematic. And that is an outcome of all of this sort of sensationalist discourse that we're all critiquing. I think they're interesting to study for other reasons, because of the things that Anna was referring to in terms of solidarity and sovereignty and whatever. But I agree that they are not, by any stretch of the imagination, the full story of pan-Islamism in Bosnia. Your point about Alia, I thought was really interesting, because so I didn't end up working on SDA as much as I thought I would going into the project, in part for the same reasons that I just mentioned with these other actors, right? I felt there was too much of a tendency to collapse what the fighters were doing into an extension of that project. But I'm curious about what you mean when you say that, Alia was a pan-Islamist and then kind of abandoned it during the war, because if that's the case, how do we understand the kinds of diplomacy and building of links that he was doing during the war with Saudi Arabia, Iran, whatever? Like I would think of it as maybe a shift in how he thought of pan-Islam, or like a different kind of pan-Islamism or a different kind of pan-Islamic praxis. But it's not clear to me that there was pan-Islamism in one moment and then an abandonment of it wholesale in the next moment. But I think this it sounds like, this might be more of like a definitional thing than like an actual, because I think the story that you're telling is one that I, agree with, right? So I'm just curious about, what we think of when we're talking about pan-Islamism, and what the stakes of that category are. Asya, I guess I'll just raise two things that you talked about. In terms of Kosovo, the story is pretty simple. The UÇK, the Kosovo Liberation Army, in part reacting to what had happened in Bosnia and seeing that the Americans basically pressured the SDA to kick all these people out, they decided, we're not going to mess with these folks. And there were attempts by some people to go and join the fight, and they were basically invited to leave. And in fact, one of the people who I discuss in this book, the Malaysian army officer who was active in the jihad in Bosnia, he went to Kosovo as well. And within a few minutes of slipping across the border, he was ambushed and very, very seriously injured. And he believes that essentially, he was betrayed, and that the UÇK tipped off the border authorities, right? So I think there, and again, towards the end of the war, and this echoes Ivan's point about betrayal, even the SDA was saying, let's get rid of these guys, right? And there's an incident on the very day that the Dayton Peace Treaty was signed. The leadership of the Jihad battalion in Bosnia was executed at a checkpoint run by the HVO, by the Croat nationalist forces. So I think there's already this moment of not necessarily betrayal of pan-Islamism in total, but at least a decision that these particular people, this particular version of pan-Islamism, was inconvenient and really needed to be disposed of. To your broader kind of methodological and conceptual point, I really wanted to uplift what you said about networks. I think the term network actually indexes and is a band-aid for conceptual poverty in a lot of these discussions, right? Because a network is just a set of points that you draw lines between. And in a way, I think the emphasis on networks is a lack, or maybe even a refusal, to think in terms of other social categories that are thicker, right? Whether it's like class, race, diaspora, whatever. And part of that is because the methodological individualism that we assume when we talk about networks is backstopped by a nation state imaginary. And once we start trying to move into a non-nation state way of thinking, suddenly the moorings for those concepts get a lot shakier, right? And network is just sort of this like stopgap measure that folks have, I think, for talking about this stuff. And yeah, it's precisely, especially in the first couple of chapters, I really want to think with these more sort of active categories that have a richer sort of connection with, history and social science and what have you. But I also, in a way, it's like, on the one hand, it gets in the way of really thinking about these people. On the other hand, it might be that for the field of terrorism studies to survive, that it has to not think about those things, right? Or to find a way of thinking about them only in ways that can be very easily weaponized, essentially. And Anna, as far as your, there's a lot of things I would have to say. So yeah, these were very rich comments. I think one thing that I'll just say, just as a clarification for the audience, the point about solidarity versus sovereignty that Anna so wonderfully kind of elaborated on, part of the reason why the book makes that point is because so much of what's been written about contemporary jihad practices really focuses on notions of capturing state power, right? So there's all of these discussions around what is an Islamic state, what about imposing Sharia, and I think that's probably like the tenor of like 90% of the writing on sort of Islamist movements broadly speaking, whether armed or unarmed. And so the point about solidarity is just to really say, not everyone who's engaged in jihad is necessarily interested in an Islamic state, right? There are many Islamists who believe that an Islamic state is itself like a contradictory sort of formulation, right? And there's rich debates around that. So anyway, that was just part of the backdrop of kind of that intervention, that Anna was sort of picking up on. There's a lot to say about the white supremacy point and the way that that the expert group is sort of trying to reinvent itself and retain relevance, right, in this era. And yeah, I think it's very some of your own research, Anna, makes this point very well, that a lot of what's happening is it's about inscribing, all of the stuff about like, how has ISIS influenced the Proud Boys, whatever. One, it of course tends to erase or downplay the historicity of white supremacist violence in the United States. Two, it tends to reinforce Islam as kind of like the baseline or the template for all of these deviant forms of violence, right? And three, it ends up being about kind of trying to restore the legitimacy of the state, and without really questioning fundamentally what the political commitments of that state are, right? So in the case of the United States, the deep sort of racialized logics, of white supremacy. So, insofar as terrorism studies wants to sort of turn its attention and sort of play this role of like the neutral arbiter, right? That says, okay, let's do Muslims on Monday and let's do, the Ku Klux Klan on Tuesday. It really distorts the deep historical and contemporary continuities, right, between state forms of white supremacy and extra state forms of white supremacy, right? So it's not like you can just, take the terrorism label off of one group and stick it onto another. So that's, and I think that's an extremely important conversation that that needs to continue to develop. I think the other point that I was reminded of when you read that quote about terrorism experts hawking wares is that I do want to emphasize that the influence of the expert communities themselves is uncertain and contingent, right? And so in a way, speaking to like people who might share some of my critical or political commitments, I think there's a little bit of a tendency to think that, the expert will ultimately drives policy, right? And this is like also a very reductive reading, for example, of Said's Orientalism, right? Knowledge leads to power, et cetera. I do want to be, I'm also interested in kind of like the entrepreneurial grifter aspect of all of this, right? People trying to, come up with different pitches, right? And ways of accessing state resources, government contracts, speaking gigs on television. Like there's a political economy and an ecology to the expertise world that is also important to think with. So we don't sort of like, give these folks, more power and more credit than they might otherwise merit. There's a lot of other things that I would love to address, but I also want to leave enough time for other folks to weigh in.
Great, thanks a lot, Darryl, for your response, and indeed. So I want to open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, or feel free to write any question you have in the chat function to Darryl or any of the other panelists, of course. So I just want to see who wants to go first, who wants to break the ice in our conversation. Of course, we've already had a lot of ice breaking in terms of the discussant. So, but apparently. I mean, while everybody is kind of working up the courage, maybe I wanna just kind of get your sense on how to research this topic, because I think this is, as an anthropologist but also as a lawyer, and you've had this kind of dual role also, not just in terms of your disciplinary background, but also in conducting this work. Can you tell us a little bit more for the audience of, how did you approach it, and what are kind of some of the challenges, also kind of the normative challenges of a researcher in this particular field?
Yeah, thank you. So I think in any research context, what's required is just a lot of honesty and humility about one's own kind of, I don't like this term, but positionality, right? Everyone, we're not just abstract researchers who are disembodied, right? We all come from a place, we all have certain kinds of social baggage that we bring, into these contexts. And there are advantages and disadvantages, right? And sometimes the disadvantages are dispositive, right? And mean that you, for whatever reason, cannot be the one to do this research. So in my particular case, it required a lot of patience. That's one reason why the book took as long as it did to produce. And also, I was extremely fortunate to have the forms of institutional support, both funding and the lack of pressure to produce so immediately, that enabled this kind of slow work to be done. And not everyone has that luxury, right? And this is a real problem, I think, with just the broader turn to sort of audit culture in the academy. We've seen what's happened, especially in the UK in the past 10 years, and I fear in the United States also similar kinds of moves. Yeah, so in this particular case, I sort of asked myself, what do I bring to the table that could be useful? And what do I bring to the table that is a strike against me, in the eyes of these folks? And, it was very apparent that obviously being, someone who was not sort of racialized as Muslim and also having a US passport were big strikes against me. And I was also, I had a previous career before graduate school of working kind of in the human rights NGO world. And I was very critical of that world and was actively trying to leave it behind when I embarked on this research. But then I came to recognize that actually the skills and contacts and habits that I had picked up in those jobs was actually one of the few useful things I could bring to the conversation with my interlocutors. Right. So to engage in different kinds of, human rights advocacy around them. But then that raised the other sort of ethical question of, how can you advocate for people, but also write about them critically? Right. So I, basically took the stance of opposing policies and laws that affected them on principle. Right. So all of these laws that Ivan alluded to, where the US, pressured Bosnia to make it easier to strip people of their citizenship without a trial, or hold them in detention on the basis of secret evidence. Those things I could oppose and do so publicly without taking a position on, whether Abu Hamza did X, Y, or Z, right? So that was the way I tried to, not subscribe to a myth of objectivity and neutrality, but at the same time, preserve some critical distance. And whether the book is successful in that is, I think, just up to readers to decide. But I think everyone will, in a research context, will have to, come up with their own way of addressing the fundamental challenges that are kind of common to everyone.
Great, thanks, Darryl. I mean, I think this is, these appreciate, because again, it is a very difficult subject. I mean, again, the ethical dimensions are, and of course, both in terms of who you're talking to, the state position. I mean, it makes it very, very difficult. So thanks for your reflections. Laura has a question for you. Laura, go ahead.
Yes, so with a caveat that although I have the ebook, I still haven't finished it, but what I've read so far, I really enjoyed. My question is, because especially in your kind of exchange with Anna, this idea of kind of looking into new conceptions and new theories when it comes to explaining these phenomena that we think we've over-explained maybe somehow, but not in this light. So as a person who also wants to escape this nation-state notions and kind of the limitations that imposes, my question is more perhaps on the theoretical side as to what you saw the benefits of employing new kind of theoretical outlooks towards an older problem was, but also what were the challenges? Because oftentimes, at least myself, I feel like I get kind of dragged into a wormhole where, I try to escape something and then end up bumping my face into it. So it's harder to kind of escape these notions and that have been so well established. So in terms of your research, how did you kind of approach it and end up doing it? And also, do you see, looking into future research, talking about experts and kind of a mixture of different forms of radicalization and violent extremism, do you think that employing these new kind of terms and theories actually leads towards a more non-Western centric theorization? And I ask this because also today I read in The Guardian that there had been a report that now criticizes the United States for crimes against humanity in terms of race, which is really a big shift when we look into kind of recommending liberal democracies to the ICC, right? To be investigated by the ICC. So it definitely marks a shift, especially with younger researchers. So also, how do you see this kind of future-oriented kind of framework? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, especially the point about younger researchers, because I think when I started this research, I took a quick look at the work that was being done and kind of ran in the other direction. And I think, although that was what I needed to do at that moment, I don't necessarily appreciate the extent to which there are many people working in this field who are chafing against certain aspects of it. And I don't intend to, write them off categorically, right? And I think, even the conversation that we're having, is a hopeful sign that it is possible to, help shift some of these conversations within these very specific, communities of expert production. I'm less optimistic about, about the relationship between scholarship and just broader political change. I think that's, something else entirely. But yeah, I think in terms of the, I think what I chose to do was to situate myself in a very different professional context. So because I went to graduate school in anthropology, and most of my anthropology interlocutors were people who had no interest in the terrorism studies world, that was very liberating, because I was not, my critiques of terrorism studies are not the product of like some personal courage or bravery. It's just because I am situated I'm accountable to a different group of people. I have to, there's just different asses I have to kiss, right? So, but that was a choice, right? Because I recognized the problems of this particular community of discourse and didn't want to be compromised by it whatsoever. I just tried to situate myself in a different one entirely. But then the downside of that, the disadvantage is, to what extent can I influence or be heard among that group that I'm criticizing, right? Like, it's not shocking that terrorism experts might not want to read this book since the book is premised on rejecting the legitimacy of their field. I still think that many of them would find it interesting, because the one thing that I would say that is a mischaracterization of some of my critiques of the field is that it's not that I don't think these groups are interesting and worthy of study, right? I mean, that's why I wrote a whole book about, particular jihad formation. But I think there's a particular defensive response I've seen from some of the terrorism expertise folks of just like, well, he's just saying we're all racist for writing about these people, which is, that's not the argument. And so I don't know exactly, what the real possibility is for this kind of cross-fertilized discourse or not. I've just, I wrote this thing. It may or may not get picked up in some of these other conversations. I hope it does. I'm not, but I'm also not sort of, I don't think that's kind of the be all and end all of the conversation.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's also in a certain way, it's interesting, and also in a contribution for research on Southeastern Europe, I mean, including the wars of the 1990s, because again, they are different, we all have, each discipline, each approach has its blind spots and its certain focuses. And I think one of the risks of research on Southeastern Europe has often been that it kind of takes the region in its isolation and not in a kind of global connectedness. And I think one thing which I appreciate about your book is kind of, the whole argument about universality and putting it into global connections, which are, of course, the ones which, and by bringing in the non-aligned movement and these other points of reference, of showing these the connections to other points of reference than the West, whatever that may be. And I think that's a larger question of research, and you alluded to it in the very beginning, how there is more research being conducted on different incarnations of this non-Western ties the region has. So it is something which I think is part of a larger debate and larger opening in the field, kind of getting out of its kind of provincialism it often risks having, i.e. being just kind of stuck in its own world rather than being kind of looking at these ties which exist globally, which exist before the 1990s, which exist afterwards, but which exist also during that period. I think we have Wolfgang Benedict who wants to ask a question. Do I see that right?
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I have to say that I have not read the book, but my question would be the following. I was always interested in the relationship between terrorism and human rights. And the basic principle here is that also terrorists have human rights. And in the Bosnian context, presumed terrorists were denied their rights, as you maybe have shown in your book. I'm thinking of the 6 who have been sent to Guantanamo. If I'm not mistaken, until today, there has been no justice for them, no compensation, no support. I was personally involved at the time to help some of them. And so I was wondering what were your findings in that respect? Ivan also mentioned that there have been violations, unfair treatment, and so on. I mean, this has come to the open later on, that there was misjudgment, mistreatment of people and so on. And I'm just wondering if there has been any accountability for that, any justice. Thank you.
Thank you. The short answer is no. There has been no accountability. And actually, as far as the Algerians who were deported from Bosnia to Guantanamo, in many ways, they are the starting point of the book. So I spent several years representing a captive, not this group, but a different gentleman who was being held in Guantanamo. And in that process, I came to know the legal team that was working on the Bosnian Algerians as well. And really the origin of my interest in the project was that I soon realized that the sort of human rights and defense lawyer community that I was working in didn't have a very clear understanding of the cultural and historical context of a lot of the people who ended up in Guantanamo, because a lot of those people were Muslims, were traveling to Afghanistan or traveling to places like Bosnia, and their transnationalness was something that was not very well appreciated at the time. So the book is absolutely concerned with human rights and with the way that the US-led war on terror has generated all of these abuses, from torture to extraordinary rendition and so on. So what kind of happens in the book is that this incident, which is very soon after 9/11, where Bosnia deports these Algerians to Guantanamo, that elicited pretty strong protests in Bosnia. So after that, the pressure on Bosnia to get rid of these people transformed. It wasn't that to something that was a little bit more legalistic and a little bit more careful, right? Because the six Algerians who were sent to Bosnia, they were sent in defiance of an order from a court in Sarajevo, right? So it was very, it was like bad for the rule of law, right? So instead, the decision was we need to take away these people's citizenship, in accordance with the rule of law. So the last chapter of the book sort of documents this process where the citizenship laws were rewritten and where some of these people were put into detention. And all of that received much, much less international attention than the incident of people going to Guantanamo, which is exactly the purpose, right? So, just having the kinds of abuses of the war on terror become more normalized and more part of the everyday sort of legal routine so that they would be seen as more acceptable.
Thank you very much. I have to read it.
Yes, I can highly recommend it. In conclusion, I just want to give our, if there are any more questions in the audience, otherwise I would give our two discussants, Asya and Ivan, another chance to raise any points in response to Darryl's answer, if you want to jump in the final round of questions at this moment.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting, and thank you once again for elaborating on some of the questions that were raised. One thing that I had in mind when I asked you about the question about Kosovo is actually how comparable are these forms of universalism that you talk about in the book in a very different context, because the way I understand your argument is that it's we should remove the context, but on the other hand, we can see that in different contexts, these forms of universalism they manifest differently at empirical level. So this was the thought that I had in mind, but I also found extremely interesting how you try to you elaborated on this disengagement or reconceptualization of jihad, because what we know about jihad from terrorism perspective, where I belong, is that it's either about individual motivation, individual drivers, or ideology, and nothing beyond that. So I really appreciate this. I feel that my horizon personally is broader now after reading it. So thank you.
Thanks. And Ivan, any last comments or questions for Darryl, and then we'll give Darryl a chance to wrap up the conversation for today.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Darryl. Really nice, beautiful presentation. And I just wanted to conclude with saying that my critiques were just in the sense that I wanted to some constructive critiques, that I opened some kind of a discussion. But I really generally think that your book is more than brilliant, and that I really appreciate what I said in the beginning, very beginning, because I'm in line with your approach with the global war on terror, and especially about the Al-Katiba unit and everything what happened and how you dealt. And I'm again want to emphasize that what you mentioned in the very beginning of this evening, of this book panel is that, it is very important that we have a right picture of the Al-Katiba unit in the context, and what Florian said, in the context of the Southern Eastern European and the war of the 90s. So I think that you really contributed massively to this field, or let's say in the sense of the war of the 90s. So thanks from my side.
Thanks, Ivan. And Darryl, I would give you a chance to have a last round of comments and reactions. And also, of course, I would be curious to hear what is your next project, because you must be working on something now that that book is done and dusted and published.
Yeah, so I'm I'm working on a project on mercenaries and military contractors in the Gulf. But all of the research for that was disrupted by the pandemic. So I'm just kind of, flailing around right now on some other extraneous papers. I just, thank you again, Ivan and Asya, for your reflections. So Asya, your question about Kosovo when comparing the universalisms, do you mean the sort of Western intervention projects, or do you? Yeah, I think it's
plus the like the non-engagement of Arab Mujahideen and the Western intervention.
Or one thing that I forgot to mention is that while there was also pan-Islamist concern with Kosovo, I think, well, okay, so the difference, there's a parallel, right? So the US attitude towards Bosnia was much more sort of like, let the different sides bleed each other out. With Kosovo, I think there was a much more decisive, approach, right? I mean, just, stepping in and sort of actively going to war, much more confrontational. And that was in a part a reaction to, what had happened in Bosnia previously. And I think similarly, I mean, I haven't studied this, closely enough, so I could be wrong, but my sense is that insofar as the US, took up the Kosovo cause more stridently than it did for Bosnia, I think that also made it less of a concern in some of these pan-Islamist discussions that I've been looking at before. I could be wrong about that. And again, I think this gets back to the conversation that Ivan and I were having about which pan-Islamism are we talking about, right? So some regimes like Jordan, I think, was very big on sort of saying, look, the US is standing up for Muslims. This shows that our closeness to the US is a good thing for Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I think others were like, well, if the US is going in there, then, maybe there's something suspicious about their concern for Muslims in Kosovo. So I think those, the sort of thorny politics of all those things do play out in kind of a different way because of the different US approach between the two situations.
Great, thanks a lot, Darryl. So thanks a lot for joining us to present your book, discuss it with our panel and our audience. I'd like to thank Asya, Anna, who had to leave a little bit earlier, Ivan, and of course, Lura Polojani, who is a researcher on the project at the Center for Southeast European Studies and who organized this event. Thank you very much to Lura. And just as a little reminder, we're having another event in the series of our EU project, and Lura has posted the details in the chat where we'll be presenting some of the first research findings in 2 weeks' time, and I hope to see many of you there. So thanks to all of you. Thanks for coming, and to be continued. And for those who haven't had a chance yet, do read this book. I think it's really important. It's very well written, and it's a pleasure to read and insightful. So good luck with your next project, Darryl, and hope to stay in touch and hope to see you soon. And maybe not too far from now in Graz live. All the best.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.